Hello, hello. This is Allie Decker, and you're listening to the Long Game Podcast. Today, I chat with one of my favorite people in the world, Kaleigh Moore. I met Kaleigh 5 years ago when I was initially moving into a freelance writing career. I was her very first coaching client. I stalked her on the internet and begged her to take me on as a new client, and I give her full credit for where I am today in my career. Kaleigh is a super well-known freelance writer, coach, and consultant. You might have seen her active on Twitter or as the co-host of either the Creative Class podcast with Paul Jarvis or her podcast called Freelance Writing Coach, which she hosts with Emma Simasco. Kaleigh started her freelance career 9 years ago and has grown her brand into an amazing mix of B2B SaaS content marketing for brands like Shopify and BigCommerce. She also writes authoritative retail journalism pieces for Forbes and Vogue Business. She's built an amazing freelance community on Twitter and across the internet, and she also consults for many startup brands as they build their own content marketing engine. In this episode, Kaleigh and I discuss everything from building career in freelance writing to honing our own creative catalysts in a super noisy world. Without further ado, here's Kaleigh. I'd love to hear, to start, kind of like how you would define what you do. I know your role and like your, I guess, professional identity has like shifted a lot. I know to me, you're still like freelance writer, but I know your job's like your career, your brand is a lot bigger now. So I'd love to hear like in your own words, how you would define that.
Oh, this is always such a tough question for me. And we had family in town last weekend and they were all asking me what I do. And I did such a horrible job explaining it. Yeah. So much so that my husband was like, I think you need to work on that a little bit. So I'm going to do my very best.
Okay.
But yes, I do still identify as a freelance writer, although I would say now I'm more of kind of working in an editor consultant capacity. Okay. So I do work with a team of subcontractors for some of the work that I do. Still a lot of work within the e-commerce and software as a service space, kind of the e-commerce platforms like Shopify, BigCommerce, those types of people, and then the tools that integrate with those for the seller side of things. So like email marketing, referral tools, affiliate programs, things like that. The two things go hand in hand. So I help with a lot of blog content, usually long form, with expert insights tied in because I have a pretty sizable network at this point in time. Lots of research, lots of like search engine optimization type stuff. But I also do a lot of other things. So I also have contentremix.com now, which is taking podcast or video audio and then turning those into narrative style recaps. So I have a team that helps me execute those. Not super marketing it at this point, but like slowly ramping up with that. It's been probably like 5 or 6 months so far. And then I also do consulting work. So for teams who are working hard to scale up, so usually startups who are pretty lean teams and looking to scale up on their content production, like how do I find freelance writers? What do I onboarding wise need to provide for the material wise? Like what's a good writing brief look like? So kind of some hand holding on that type of stuff as teams work on how do we up production without hiring a bunch of people. So those are kind of the three main buckets of things that I do today. I also occasionally contribute to retail publications. So like Forbes, Adweek. I haven't done Vogue Business in a while, but I do that sometimes as well. And then a little bit for the quality edit as well. So very busy, mini spinning plates.
So between the three buckets, how would you what percentage of your time do you spend on each basically?
It depends on how many consulting arrangements I have at the time, but I would say the bulk of it is still with the content creation side of things. So a lot of it at this point is like people management, making sure briefs are really, really thorough, a lot of editing, a lot of collaborating on just making sure drafts are where they should be. So yeah, that's where the bulk of my time is spent.
That's awesome. I want to go back a little bit. And these are questions I think I know the answers to, but just to recap for our listeners, I want to hear about your first few freelance jobs and how it started. Let's go way back.
Okay. So I started doing this on the side while I was working my full-time job. That was about 9 years ago. My first couple freelance jobs, I was doing some social media management just because it was something I had experience with running my own e-commerce store. So just did some networking locally and was like, hey, do you need a young person to basically come in and help you figure all this out? So that was my first true freelance type of work. It quickly, though, evolved into me realizing I didn't really love that work. And so I started doing more of the writing, which I did really love. And I did some like website copy projects. I did some blog writing, all of it for very, very little money. But really loved the work and was like, wow, I could do this. And like, I'm pretty efficient and I like this. I want to do this full time. So yeah, my first couple of jobs, I worked for a lot of different types of industries. So I did like an HVAC company's website. I did some, medical independent review, like just so random stuff. And it was scary because every time I had to start a new assignment, I was starting from zero. I had to research, I had to learn about the industry. And so that was really, really stressful. So yeah, those were my first few jobs and just kind of feeling things out as I went.
Yeah, I feel like most freelancers have those jobs. Like I remember someone reached out to me about writing for like a horse training site because I was from Kentucky. Purely what they went off of. And I was like, theoretically, I should know about this, but no, I can't. I can't do this. I remember with you, like working the coaching that you did for me, like you were the first person to teach me the importance of having a niche or a niche or however you pronounce it. Like that was one of the first big lessons I took away from that. And the turning down the horse job was like my first exercise in that. I was like, in theory, I could write about this, but it's too much work.
That's the thing. And when you are getting started, it's really tempting to say yes to every opportunity because you're like, well, I need the money.
Right.
Like, I'm not busy.
Right.
But it's so stressful. Once you get into it, you're just like, I am so out of my depths.
So your e-commerce business was jewelry, correct? Did that influence like how you chose your own niche and what you wrote about?
Yeah. So I think I kind of naturally transitioned into that e-commerce space that I'm still in today because I had that hands-on experience. So I could pull from being that seller, I could pull from my own experiences with testing different marketing tactics and the pain points of like being in the shoes of the merchant. And so I still pull from that today. Obviously, I'm always learning and I'm not in it myself anymore, but having that perspective, I think was a great value add as I was pitching myself for these opportunities. And I think it really did kind of help start the snowball effect within that space, because then I had some sort of springboard for those conversations and saying that like, hey, I'm not just a newbie writer. I've also done this a little bit myself.
Yeah, that's huge. I feel like that's kind of expert insights before expert insights were a thing.
Yeah.
Do you think now, like knowing what you do, you would ever jump back into being an e-commerce merchant or starting a store?
Yeah, I think about it all the time. I really do. And the reason I sold my business when I started doing this full time is that I was like, I can't do two things well. And I don't want to half-ass two things. I'd rather whole-ass one thing. So I don't know if you can say ass, maybe bleep me. But yeah, I do think about it. And especially with everything that I know today and all of the opportunity that I see within the e-commerce space, it's really tempting. But I try to remind myself like, shiny object syndrome is real and just try to focus.
I feel it too. I wonder if most writers do, because as a writer, you get to touch so much, like high level, right? Like the research, like sometimes I'm researching something and I'm like, I want to play, like I want to do this, but then I just have to write about it. And I'm like, okay, this is all I can do today. All I can manage well. So I definitely feel that. So I want to touch more on, so you went from e-commerce and you wrote about it and the SaaS tools that integrate with those platforms, but I see you working more with D2C now. Like I've seen a lot of things that you post, products that you get or buy from friends or clients. Do you work with more D2C now than you did before? Or is it still kind of a healthy mix between like software and then D2C?
It's funny. I actually don't work with that many D2C companies at all. I've done some copy auditing for them in the past, but it's mostly in the context of like the reporting work that I do and just industry expertise. I feel like that's kind of how I've navigated and fallen into that sub niche within the e-commerce world. And I think that was part of the part of the reason I've really put a flag in this particular area, because a couple of years ago, my husband was like, this D2C space is direct to consumer space is emerging, and you should look into that. And there's this whole community online of people who talk about this one specific area. And so by being enmeshed in that community and becoming part of that world, it opened doors to new opportunities as well. So not only does it help the client work that I still do today, but on the reporting side of things, it's opened more doors there. It's helped me get more like trend insight, news insight, things like that. So those two things go together really well.
Yeah, I would imagine too, writing for publications like Shopify and BigCommerce, like having that kind of direct network, you can be a really awesome advocate for them. And then you have like sources automatically. Like you don't have to go for quotes and data and stuff like that.
And it's great for SEO too, because every time you quote somebody and you let them know when the piece goes live, that is a way to boost organic sharing. They don't always share it, but a lot of times people do. So that's a nice value add that I can bring to the table.
For sure. So how did you start building that network? Just curiosity and reaching out?
Yeah, a lot of it's through Twitter. So I've been on Twitter for a really long time. And again, my husband was like, you should check out these people who are talking about this. And so I went to Twitter, started kind of seeing what these people were talking about. And then those conversations sometimes moved into Slack groups or one-to-one phone calls. So yeah, I just kind of evolved from there. But I think also it's like looking to the niche publications who are writing about those types of things too. So just by finding them and then becoming part of those communities and really participating there and getting some name and face recognition. I know that sounds kind of vague when I talk through it, but that's really how it happened.
Yeah. So how do you balance like your creative content creation work and then like pouring into those communities and staying engaged? Like, how do you mentally balance those two things?
I think staying engaged with the communities is sort of like my office water cooler. So I have been working alone from home for 8 years. There's no sound on all day long because I can't write to any noise or anything. So I use those as breaks throughout the day to talk to people and to feel that connection and to beat away the isolation that sometimes comes with this type of work. So I don't think it's necessarily an either or, but it's kind of a nice supplement to my daily workday to just be able to pop in and like see what people are talking about and go back and forth and chime in with my 2 cents, things like that.
So what does your day-to-day look like these days?
So I typically do 2 main sprints for my workday, one in the morning, one in the afternoon, break it up with a really short lunch break and a couple of dog walks. So a lot of it, I sit down around 8:00 most of the time and I'll do my first sprint. I'll start with some email, just kind of putting together my to-do list for the day. And then I'll get into a sprint of deep work for about 2.5 hours. Take a walk, come back, answer a few more emails, take a lunch break, another work sprint in the afternoon, about 2.5 hours. Because I find that like much more than that, the quality really starts to drop off.
It does. Yeah.
So I've tried to just really tap into those 2 parts of the day where I know I can be really productive and try to maximize those as much as I can. So no calls then, no meetings, just sit down, knock off the to-do list for the day. And then I try to wrap things up around like 4:30. Again, just like popping into email, seeing what things are left on the to-do list, checking in with people, just kind of like management stuff towards the end of the day.
Gotcha. How do you balance like when you do have meetings and interviews? Like, do you sprinkle those in or do you tend to batch them on certain days of the week?
Yeah, I definitely try to batch them. For a long time, I didn't do that. And so I would have calls sprinkled at different times all throughout the week, and it would just wreck my productivity and my workflow. I could never get into a good session of deep work because I was always thinking about, okay, I need to get ready for this, or this is coming up. It's just really distracting to me. So I started batching them on 1 to 2 days a week, and I started implementing the no calls on Friday rule, which has been amazing.
Yes, I've heard of that. I need to start doing that. Tell me about how you schedule out your projects. Like, how do you know how long they're going to take you? Because I know you said you have 3 main buckets, sometimes other stuff going on. How do you divvy those up?
It's really, I don't have a strategic or scientific way of doing it. It's really just, I know kind of what my capacity is at this point after doing it for so long. So I'm just kind of always mentally tracking. I have a paper to-do list and just kind of like a spreadsheet of all the things that I'm doing right now, deadlines, due dates, all of those things are written down. So they're always right in front of me. So I'm always just really cognizant, mindful of what's coming up and how full my plate is. And so once the plate starts getting full to the point where I'm like a little bit nervous, that's when I start saying, okay, my next available start date is like 3 to 4 weeks out. And so I'll start giving myself some padding before the next project.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'd say that's a good thing to do. That feeling of nervousness, I think everyone knows how that feels, like, oh, going back to that whole, like, I want to say yes to this, but I know I shouldn't. Kind of honing that judgment call. So you have a podcast with Emma. Tell me about that.
So Emma Samasco is a fellow freelance writer. She and I have always done really similar work, oftentimes with a lot of the same clients. Funny enough, she also was the first SaaS client that ever hired me. So at the time she was working at grasshopper.com and was the content manager there. And through Twitter, she and I just started talking. I think it was about my e-commerce store, actually.
Yeah.
That conversation moved to the inbox, and that was my first SaaS client. So she and I have worked together for a really long time. She also, shortly after, started working with me. About a year after that, she quit the job and started freelance writing full-time. So really similar paths, really similar client base. And what we do on the show, which is called Freelance Writing Coach, we just talk about issues and questions related to freelance writing, because there's no real guidebook when it comes to how do I do this well? How do I, get great clients? How do I not hate my life every day? So we talk about those things. And a lot of the time it's just answering questions we get from listeners and talking through, like, how do I put together a great portfolio, or how many clients should I have, and things like that. So just talking through our own experiences, but trying to shed some light on these types of topics for people who are in the same boat.
Yeah. Do you still do your one-on-one coaching?
I have the offering out there, but I haven't done any in about a year and a half. And I think the reason for that is, number one, I'm busy. Like, I'm super busy with work. And number two, I've kind of transitioned more, and what I do is always evolving, but I've transitioned more into now consulting with, like, on the client side of things rather than working one-to-one with writers. And I think I like that better. I think that I just feel like it's a little bit more engaging for me at this point. And so I find myself sending those people who are interested in the coaching to other people who do that type of service.
Right.
And so I love that I did that in the past, and I love still talking about those and teaching about those, but the one-to-one basis, I feel like my time is like better served on the consulting side, using the expertise that I have at this point. And that's just totally personal preference.
Yeah. And I feel like that podcast is helpful. Like, it's kind of
coaching at scale. That's right.
But just at one time and getting them recorded, sending it out. But yeah, I mean, to me, you have, and this might be a simplification, but you've single-handedly created that kind of freelance writing community that I think I certainly didn't feel that was present when I was starting, but you were a huge help for me early on. And now, I'm kind of stepping back into freelancing now and seeing like the structure that you've created, if not inspired, it's like huge for me. Is that something that you set out to do, or were you kind of just looking for things that you wish you had?
I was just, there were so many things I wish I knew and I hadn't learned the hard way. So yeah, it's really just sharing those things that I learned through trial and error in hopes that it'll help somebody else skip over those things that I was like, I wish I would have known that, or I wish I wouldn't have done that. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's just, like you said, it's coaching at scale. It's sharing that expertise. It's, just trying to shed some light on this, because again, like, people hear freelance writing or they freelance anything and they're like, oh, you don't have a job. Like, you're doing this in between two full-time roles. And that's the conception. So I want to share that this is a really viable career path, and it can be really profitable, and it's, something you can do for a decade or more, rather than just like a stopgap career solution, I guess.
Yeah, no, I've seen that too. The clients that you have that you consult with, do they view freelancing in the same way? Like, do they tend to want to hire freelancers in the long run or as more of a stopgap until they build their full-time team?
It really depends, but I think for a lot of, especially small teams who are just getting started, freelance is just like the most natural fit for them because they don't have the resources to hire full-time team members, but they need help scaling up what they're already doing. So especially when they can hire subject matter experts, it's just a really natural fit. So it depends. Sometimes they eventually want that to evolve into a team of in-house writers, but at least in my experience, there's still always freelance writers that are part of the equation because even with the in-house team, there's still so much to do day to day. So as far as like production and scaling, they still need that external help.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. I mean, I feel like that's something a lot of small teams and startups just don't have. It's not a very innate sense, like working with freelancers and managing a lot of moving parts, even though it is a sense of like outsourcing and subcontracting, there's still a lot of like structure to be created. So I would imagine that's a good thing to learn early on so that when you do inevitably outsource in the long run, like you kind of have that skill set as a manager.
Yeah. And that, like I said, that's a lot of what the consulting work I've done is like,
Right.
how do we put together a style guide? What kind of onboarding deck do we need for our freelance writers? So they're really consistent, understand our brand. Like, do you have customer personas? Do you have an editorial calendar? Do you have a content strategy? Like all of these building blocks you need to have in place for the freelance people that you hire to be successful, just helping get those things in place.
Totally. So I want to talk a little bit about Creative Class. I know you're not doing that anymore. But I'm curious, how did you get started with Paul Jarvis? Like, what did that look like? How did that catalyze like growth, business growth and work for you over time?
Yeah. So Creative Class was a course on the business. Well, it still is a course on the business side of freelancing. I took it, I think my first year into freelancing full time. So that was like 2014. I took the course. Again, was still before that, just doing a lot of different random projects, no real niche or specialization. And I took that course and I was like, oh my gosh, this is the secret. Like, this is how I become a go-to person. I need to specialize. I need to have really professional looking processes in place. Basically, like I just need to get my stuff together. Like I need to have a workflow and be a professional person when I come into these working relationships. And so about 2 years after that, Paul sent out an email and was basically just doing a survey on like, hey, I'm going to do version 2 of the course. What can I do to make it better? And right off the bat, I was like, you need X, Y, and Z, and I can help you do them. And he was like, okay, why don't you come on board as a partner? And so just by kind of raising my hand and saying like, I have an idea and I can help you execute it, that opened that door to that partnership. And so he and I did that as co-teachers and collaborated on the next version of the course. And that ran for probably like 3 years. I think we had 6 seasons of our podcast together. We had probably close to 3,500 students go through the course. So it was a really great experience to see, one, how the course was built, because that was Paul's expertise, and 2, the feedback from students, the questions that they had. And again, that's a kind of something I springboarded off of for this new podcast that I have with Emma. So it was really cool just to have that as part of my journey. And I think that was a good ethos builder too, because Paul had a much larger audience than I did. So yeah, it was just a cool thing to be part of. And again, like just raised my hand and said, let me help you. Here's how.
Right. So how did that close? Like, what was the thought process behind the end? And like, what did that look like for you guys?
Yeah. So the course now, we used to launch it twice a year. It's now open indefinitely, but we're not doing the podcast anymore. But after about 3 years, he and I were both kind of going in different directions. He was building new software and I was doing more consulting and things like that, really narrowing in on the freelance writer audience rather than just like freelancers in general as one bucket. Yeah. And so it was just a really natural time for us to be like, okay, we should probably like move on from this, but leave it open because the material is pretty evergreen. So yeah, it was just less of a time commitment on our part with no more launches, no more podcasts, but the material is still there. So it's still open today. We still have people, trickle into the course, but we're not actively marketing it. We're not sending out emails, anything like that.
Gotcha. So how do you educate yourself today?
Lots of reading, lots of Twitter time too. I feel like Twitter is such a great place to hear about trends and things that are emerging within your space. Follow really smart people who know more than you and see what they're talking about. I also subscribe to a lot of great newsletters that are pretty niche again. And so just being really curated about what things I let into my brain and let get in there because there's so much noise. But yeah, I also do a lot of like researching and reading for the writing work or editing work that I do. So it's kind of part of the job, I feel like, to stay up on things.
So how do you balance, I guess this goes back to the same thing, the same question about like the community engagement. Like, how do you balance execution and then like absorption in your day?
It's hard. It's really hard. And I struggle with that. I feel like I'm one of those people who feels like I could always be doing a little bit more. And that's a really, really slippery slope, especially when you're very competitive, you're very driven. It's really easy to be like always on, always taking things in. And so I've gotten to the point where I had to start going to therapy. I had to start pumping the brakes a little bit because I was just so overwhelmed. When I would lay down to go to sleep at night, my head would just run and run and run and run. And I would think about all the things I still needed to do, all the things I still didn't get done. And it was just like this never ending cycle of bad feeling. And so I had to put some boundaries in place. I just recently took social media off my phone. So I'm experimenting with that. And just, if I want to look at it, I can look at it on the computer. So that's one thing I've done.
Yeah.
But I've also like made sure to make time for things that are totally different from what I do day to day. So like lots of time for reading, lots of time for exercise, being outside while it's nice, just building in some healthy habits, like going to a yoga class once a week and stuff like that, because it's so easy to just be glued to the computer or your phone. I feel like I'm especially prone to like just really moth to the flame on that.
I really feel like that is the downside of doing what you love for work, because it eats away at all your other time in the day. I feel that too. I had to take Twitter off my phone. I already struggle to sleep, right? So like it's 11:30 and I'm like, oh, I'm going to try to like wind down. And I just I almost said twit, like scroll on Twitter. And I'm like, look at all the stuff people are doing. Look at all the things that I should be doing. Because why not? Right. And I started to feel like if I can do it, I should do it. And that's so absurd, right? Like you can do anything you want, but that doesn't mean you should be doing everything under the sun. And there's just so much opportunity now, and that's great, but it doesn't mean do it, all of it. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you and I are probably the same in that, like you want to be the best, like you want to know all of the things and do what other people are doing. And so, that comparative thing that social media makes so easy to do, it's a really easy trap to fall into. Yeah.
And there's so much dialogue about self-improvement today, which is great, right? Like so much better than even 5 years ago. But even that can feel like, look at all the things you should be improving about yourself. Like, look at all the ways you could be better, all the courses you could take, all the supplements you could take, all the exercise you could be doing. And it's all in the name of like improvement and growth. But I think some people just don't pace themselves in that. And then there's just inevitable burnout, not even work burnout, but like just improvement, like growth. Burnout. I felt it too, because in the last year, there's, like I said in the beginning, not a lot going on, right? I think people are getting busier now, but look at all the time you have because you're stuck at home. Look at all the things you should be doing. Gosh, I burnt out real quick on that. I've had to scale back and just exist.
Yeah. Like I cannot read business books. I can't listen to business podcasts because at the end of the day, I don't want to take in more information.
Yeah.
I want entertainment. I want to decompress. I need a break. So I think it's really just like identifying those triggers for you that like start the anxiety cycle and then cut them and make room for something else.
Do you listen to podcasts at all?
I do listen to podcasts, but if I do, they're for fun. So the most businessy I get is like a Tim Ferriss when he's interviewing a writer that I want to hear from. Yeah. But other than that, that's it. It's all fun.
You don't listen
no
to
business books, nothing. What'd you say?
I said you don't listen to My First Million every day.
I don't. I just can't. I can't do it.
Me neither.
I can't do it. My husband does.
My favorite are the scary ones, the horror ones. And it's so different than what I do. And it's so refreshing because honestly, like I've found that when you lean into like what inspires you, it's going to creatively help you in what you do every day. Even if it's super irrelevant to your work, it's all about like that personal catalyst. Yeah. But yeah, I listen to like lore and like My Favorite Murderer. Yeah. I love horror books. And I find that when I do sit down to work, I feel like creatively refreshed.
Yes.
Because gosh, my business cup has been overflowing for a while.
That is a great way to put it. I feel the exact same way.
Yeah. I don't need any more of that. So
yeah.
So what kind of stuff have you been reading? You know, I guess you said what podcasts, but like what kind of ways do you feed yourself creatively?
Yeah. So the podcasts I really love, there's one called Art Curious where they talk about just interesting stories behind paintings or sculptures, things like that. It's super fun. I also read a lot of Hot Sexy Garbage, which I would call like modern romance, like beach read type stuff. But I mix that up with like some historical fiction, some memoir. I do like sci-fi, but I'm like very picky about sci-fi. Mm-hmm. So I'm probably one of my library's best customers. I go every week and get a big stack of books.
Oh my God.
And so, yeah, it's great. I save a ton of money and it's good practice. Like reading anything is good practice for your writing brain because you get really comfortable with syntax and vocabulary and structure and writing voice and all of those things. Mm-hmm. But the subject matter is fun to me. So it doesn't feel overwhelming and it feels like you know, an extracurricular. Yeah. And so bath culture is another thing that I'm very into. I take a bath almost every night. And that's when I do a lot of my reading. And it's just a really good wind down for the end of the day. It helps me sleep. So yeah, that's my thing. Oh my favorite book that I've read recently was one called Sorrow and Bliss by Meg Mason. Okay. Which is fiction. I would compare it to like Fleabag if you watch that show. But it was just a really fun read that was really beautiful and really well written. I loved that one.
So do you do any writing like outside of B2B SaaS and stuff? Like how do you balance your creative writing in general?
Yeah. So I did the NaNoWriMo National Novel Writing Month about 2 years ago and was able to finish it. I have not revisited it since then because I'm intimidated, but I have done some editing work for friends who have written books that are like fiction stories. So like, for example, I just finished editing one for a friend who was on their second or third draft. And it was just a creative writing project that they did. And that really, I feel like kind of inspired me to pick mine back up. But that was such a cool thing to do. It was great to switch gears and to get into the editorial mode for a creative project. Because it made me think about writing in general a lot and what I like and what I don't like, what things work, what don't. And again, like that's a side project. It's a creative thing, but it does have benefits for the work that I do day to day too. So it's a good thing to have.
And then talk to me about your writing process for like a B2B SaaS or e-commerce SaaS platform, all the words, like that kind of work. And then like a Forbes article.
Okay. Yeah. So the software and like e-commerce writing work that I do, it's usually pretty long form, pretty research heavy. So that workflow and process is very, very regimented, very structured. Mm-hmm. Starts with a super detailed writing brief. And then I just do like a brain dump when I'm researching. So start building out a messy outline and then tweaking the outline to make it cleaner, make more sense, more organized, structurally, things like that. Then do some outreach to people, get some quotes to tie in, get some data, get some images, get some examples to tie in. So that's kind of the format for how I build those out. Mm-hmm. But for like a Forbes or a journalism type reported piece, it's a lot quicker. It's usually a matter of like, here's the focus of the article. Here's some research to support it. Here's some insight from an analyst or somebody within the space. And that's it. It's because they're pretty short form. They're usually like 850 words.
Right.
So yeah, they're really quick to knock out, and it's a pretty formulaic approach.
Gotcha. So how do you pitch those ideas, or do they send you those?
Most of the time I pitch. And so because I have great relationships with editors, it's most of the time like, yeah, run with it. Like there's not a lot of back and forth or, workshopping ideas. So I think that that's another benefit too, to really knowing the space, is that you can easily spot the trends and things that are new and position those as like, here's something we need to be talking about. So that's a great value add for those types of engagements if you're interested in doing that kind of thing too.
Do you tend to kind of come across those ideas in your other kind of research work? Or is it like after hours, you're scrolling, you're reading, and you're like, wait a second, I see something?
It's a little bit of both, but I would say probably 75 to 80% of the ideas I get is just from watching Twitter and seeing what people are talking about, seeing how people are like, hey, look at this brand doing X, Y, and Z. This is really new and interesting. And sometimes if the well is dry, I will just go to the expert sources I know and be like, hey, what are you seeing?
Gotcha.
Give me some ideas on like emerging trends or patterns that you're noticing. And then I can also leverage them as the expert in the story, but it gives me some fuel for ideas.
So how do you manage your network? Like, do you have like a spreadsheet or like a CRM or just?
I used to be really strategic about it. But at this point, honestly, and this is so non-scientific, but I will go to Twitter. I have a really curated following list and I will type in, like if I'm looking for an expert source, say I need like somebody who knows consumer packaged goods, for example. So I'll go in and type in that keyword into my search bar and then filter it by people I follow. And that'll give me a short list of people I can talk to. So it's a great tool for that. And I also monitor like keywords in conversation. So if there are people who are talking about the topic, that's again, an easy way to find people who know about that.
So how would you recommend curating a Twitter following? Like, is it just trial and error? Like, I'm going to follow this person, and then you're like, never mind.
A little bit. Yeah. And so I look for people who focus on one really specific area when they're tweeting. I want to know what their expertise is, what they're talking about. I don't mind if they sprinkle in some personal things. That's totally fine. But I want there to be a good amount of value from the things that they're sharing there. That's also what I try to do with like sharing writing and freelancing insights through my Twitter account. But it's just a really strict, like I have less than 1,000 people that I follow, and I'm always kind of going through and being like, this person hasn't said anything for a while, so I'm going to unfollow, just keeping it pruned down and making sure that there's as little noise as possible. So I want people who are really active, who are talking about things that are relevant and interesting to what I'm doing, and that are well known within the space too. I want people who are not just like brand new to the topic coming in to chime in, but like have some sort of foundational expertise around the topics.
Right. Yeah. I mean, what you said earlier about cutting the noise, it's more real than ever.
It's so noisy.
How do you do that across the board? I know you said newsletters, Twitter, like, how would you recommend doing that? Because I personally am struggling with that right now. Yeah.
Just be really selective. Find out what things you actually find yourself opening, reading, listening to, and everything else has got to go.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of quality out there, but I think it's different for every person what is interesting and useful to you. So be really clear about what that looks like and then cut everything else.
Whew, it's so hard now.
It's so hard.
it's an awesome culture we live in now, this like creation culture. I think it's more encouraging than it's ever been, but there's so much junk. People just put stuff out there to be heard. And honestly, and this is speaking from someone who I don't always feel like I deserve to be heard. Like I'm still working on like what I know and what I feel like I have the right to share. But some people just don't like filter themselves. They're just like, I just have a voice. Like I'm interesting. I am cool. I need to be heard. And I'm like, no, you really don't. Why don't you figure out what you like and what you know, and then have a voice? So sometimes I hold myself back too, because I don't want to produce junk either, but
yeah, I think as long as you have a background in the thing that you're talking about and you are not just like brand new to the space, just chiming in to be chiming in, you probably have some unique perspective to share. And so I think a lot of people feel that way where they're like, I don't know if I should say anything. I would always encourage people to participate when it makes sense.
right.
But yeah, like look at the people you follow or who you really look up to, or like how do they do it? Kind of reverse engineer their approach and try to do something similar.
So what newsletters are you connected to?
I don't read a whole lot, but there are 3 that jump out at me. Snack Shot by Andrea Hernandez is number 1. She's talking about emerging trends within like the snack drink space and direct consumer. Super interesting, really fun. 2PM is one that I've subscribed to for years. That's like my go-to source for everything D2C and e-commerce and retail. Great source of information there. Lots of original reports. Really good thing. And then Lean Lux is another one. More so even than the newsletter, which is great. I really love the private Slack channel that they have. It's kind of hard to get into the Slack channel. There's some rules and requirements you have to meet up with, but that has been such a great source of community for me and for connecting with experts, different things like that. So those are the big 3.
Those are awesome. I've heard of 2PM, but not the others. So
yeah, they're really, really great.
Snack Shot. That's cool. I see like all the stuff you post on Instagram, like the drinks and snacks. And I'm like, how does she do this stuff?
It's super fun.
Yeah. Well, I have a couple like fun questions for you for the end that might spurn off other questions, but we'll see. So 3 biggest catalysts to where you are today, moments, projects, people, like 3 biggest ones that you give credit to where you are today.
Yeah. 2 of them I think I already touched on. So number 1 was connecting with Emma, who worked at a software company, and she started the snowball effect for getting into the software as a service space. That was my first time working in that capacity. And then with the e-commerce perspective that I have and how things evolved there, it was kind of good timing, good, right place at right time. So that conversation, that organic thing that just happened on Twitter, that was the first one. Yep. Number 2 was taking the creative class. That was a big one that opened doors to new opportunities down the road and got me into the teaching space, which I'm still doing today. And then the third one would probably be, so probably about 4 or 5 years into freelancing full time, my husband was like, you should set a goal for yourself to get a byline in a big publication by October of this year. And I was like, well, why should I do that? And he was like, well, it's good for authority building. It's something you can put on your resume. It can open doors for conversations because people are happy to get interviewed for, a big publication like that. It'll give you access that you wouldn't have otherwise. And so I was like, okay. And within like 2 months, I had Entrepreneur, Fast Company, Inc. So yeah, it was just like, that was a good goal for me to have. And I feel like he's always pushing me to do those types of things. And that's work that I still do today. And again, that furthered my stake in the ground with the kind of retail e-commerce space, is writing for those publications, and the authority that built further positioned me in that space. So that was a really strategic move. Financially, it wasn't great, but it, like I said, it opened doors to conversations. Right. And gave me access to people that I wouldn't normally get the chance to talk to. So that was a good benefit.
That's awesome. So how do you work with Brandon? Like, do you guys work together often?
So we do. It's more behind the scenes than anything else. He's the one who came up with the idea for Content Remix, which again is like not something we're actively promoting, but it's going really well so far without doing any marketing. Yeah. He also helps me with kind of the technical stuff. So he built my website. He always proofreads my newsletters. He also came up with Write Club, which is another newsletter I run where I do interviews with editors, authors, writers, usually like once or twice a month. I'll put those out. So yeah, he is a great source of ideas. He's always pushing me to try new things, which is sometimes very frustrating and annoying, but it's good. But yeah, he also is always listening to the business podcasts and reading the business books that I won't read. So I get that passively through listening to him, which is a nice like value add.
Yeah.
He does a lot behind the scenes though. I have to give him credit for that.
So tell me about Write Club. How do you meet those folks? How do you decide who to interview?
Yeah, I, again, often use Twitter, but sometimes it's a way for me to talk to people that I want to learn more about who they are and what they do. So having the Q&A format with them is a really nice way for me to be curious and ask those questions, but also to give them a spotlight and a platform to tell their story. Some of my favorite interviews that I've done, I got to talk to Eric Larson. He wrote Devil in the White City, and a bunch of other books, but he was one of my favorite authors. So that was really cool to talk to him one-to-one. There's so many people who have really diverse backgrounds, have really struggled to find their place within the writing world. So it's been really interesting to get those insights. It also keeps me humble, I feel like, to hear about the adversity they've faced or the struggles that they've come into. A lot of the journalists that I talk to, that's a really grueling career path. So it really makes me respect the people who do that full time, hearing about, just, oh, we need to unionize, or the pay is not great, or there's a lot of pressure within the newsroom, stuff like that. It's great perspective to have. It keeps me happy with what I'm doing.
Yeah, I can hear and see the excitement in your voice. Would you say that's one of your favorite like passion projects?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. It's really, what's that?
How did you get started with that again?
That was just an idea that Brandon had. I think originally we had talked about doing like branded merchandise, which I hope we'll still do down the road, but it just kind of was like, well, we need to have some content to build this up in the first place. And so it was like, well, why don't you do interviews with writers and editors and things like that? So I was like, okay, well, let me see who I know and see who'd be willing to talk to me. And I think we've probably done like 30 interviews so far over the past couple of years. So we've tried to stay really consistent with it. Sometimes it's hard because people can be really slow to get back, but we put it out as often as we can. And like I said, it's a fun way for me to learn as well.
Are they typically live or more email, like async?
Yeah, I try to do async because I know that people are so busy. So it's usually just a Google form. Or if it's easier, they can do like an audio recording, talking through their answers, just to make it as efficient as possible for them. Because I know people are busy.
Yeah, well, I'm sure that's easy too, to have a few moments to like think on your answer.
Yeah.
Async, then just like respond, even though live conversations are always good for like getting those off the cuff like ideas and thoughts, but sometimes the async is preferable. Awesome. So I've one more question, and it's one of my favorite to answer or ask. I'm sorry. What's your favorite mistake that you've made?
Oh gosh. Let me think on that. Favorite mistake. The thing that's coming to my mind is that when I started doing this, I was doing the social media work, whether it was social media management or advising. And I thought I liked that because at the time, again, this was a decade ago, but it was new and it was something I knew about, and it made me feel like I had something valuable to bring to the table. But I got into it and I realized how quickly it changed and how tedious it could be and how time consuming, and you're always on, like you're always fielding messages from people. So I'm glad that I did that to learn that it wasn't what I wanted to do. I feel like sometimes that's the best way to learn, is to do something and figure out if it works or it doesn't. And for me, that was like, I don't like this at all. I don't want to do this anymore. And that's what kind of pushed me into the writing path. So it was a good mistake. And it was the thing that got me to leave the full-time job. I had 2 contracts doing the social media management, and it was a monthly retainer. So it has some financial security to it, and it got me to make the leap, but I'm glad that I don't have to do it anymore.
Yeah, I would say so too. That's not my favorite at all. Well, I'm glad that you got to where you are today, because I know you changed my life five-ish years ago. And I'm sure it made a difference.
I think, you were my very first coaching client. So I'm so glad that we got to learn from each other, because now I'm learning from you, I feel like. And it's so cool to see how far you've come and all the things that you're doing. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think I found you on Entrepreneur.
Oh.
I remember I was sitting in my cubicle at GE in Louisville, bored out of my mind. And all I knew is I wanted to write. No idea what that looked like, right? It's like the same thing as trying to explain what you do to like your parents. You're like, I create words. But like at the time I was like, that's all I knew I wanted to do. And I didn't know what it was supposed to look like in practice. And I remember I came across like your byline and I was kind of in a rabbit hole of like clicking in websites and Twitter and all this stuff. And then you were like, I write freelance. And I was like, I'm just going to like stalk the heck out of this person and figure out how to have their life. And I saw you were doing coaching and I was like, ooh, perfect. So you definitely changed my life. And I know you've done the same for thousands of other people. So,
oh, that's so nice. It does. Honestly, I feel like most of the time I'm like working from my home office in the Midwest and like screaming into the void. So it's so nice to hear that.
No, you certainly have left a mark on, I know, probably thousands, tens of thousands of people. People talk about you all the time in our circle and how big of an influence you are. So yeah, you've done it.
So cool.
Well, last thing, just share a few ways people can find you, connect with you, projects that you're working on.
Yeah. You can find me on Twitter. My handle there is Kaleigh F. First name's kind of hard to spell, so probably have to look that up. But I also have a newsletter. So I have several newsletters, obviously. I have my core newsletter through my website at kaleighmoore.com, where I share tips on writing and freelancing. And I also have writeclub.com, where we have the interviews with writers and editors. Freelance Writing Coach Podcast is the podcast we talked about where Emma and I talk through issues related to freelance writing. And yeah, that's probably plenty.
Check them out. They're all awesome. Check them out. All right. Well, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.